The slap was louder than the chatter of passengers, louder than the rolling carts, louder than the impatient sighs of people waiting for takeoff. For a split second, the entire cabin froze. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, heads snapped toward the sound, and all that remained was the sting of disbelief hanging in the air. A pilot, uniform pressed, cap tilted just so, had raised his hand and struck a woman seated quietly in first class. She didn't scream. She didn't fight back. She sat there, unmoving, eyes steady, face turned toward him with a calm that unsettled even those who had moments earlier questioned her presence. Gasps rippled through the rows. Someone muttered, "Did that really just happen?" Another passenger, phone in hand, pressed record without thinking. The screen lit up, capturing the moment that would soon ignite a storm far larger than anyone inside that aircraft could imagine. The pilot's jaw tightened as if he expected compliance, as if violence would silence her. But what he didn't expect was who she was. This wasn't an ordinary passenger. She wasn't someone who would fade into the background or disappear once security arrived. No, she was someone whose very name carried the weight of authority, whose signature had once changed the future of entire precincts. And though the slap marked a shocking beginning, it was what followed that would rip the mask off the illusion of control. The rows buzzed with whispers, but her silence held more power than their panic. It was the kind of silence that speaks louder than raised voices, the kind that makes everyone realize they're part of something that cannot be undone. And in that silence, the question wasn't whether the pilot had gone too far. The question was how far the consequences would reach once the truth came to light. Before we go any further, take a second. Subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ so you never miss stories that speak truth to power. And drop in the comments the country you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Because what happened on that flight, it didn't end with a slap. It began with it. And by the time the wheels touched the ground, lives, careers, and entire reputations were already crumbling. Stay with me, because the story behind that single act of arrogance will leave you questioning not only the system that allowed it, but the silence of those who sat by and watched. The slap was only the spark. What came after was the fire. She was used to the stares. From the day she pinned her first badge to her chest, she'd learned that people often measured her worth before they heard her speak. Too young, too black, too female. They had whispered it in precinct hallways, muttered it in briefing rooms, and sometimes spat it out directly when they thought no one else was listening. But each time, she pushed forward, not because she wanted to prove them wrong, but because she knew she was right where she belonged. Her name was Renee Carter. 45 years old. Chief of police for one of the country's largest metropolitan areas. She carried herself with the discipline of someone who had seen too many lives lost too soon, too many mothers crying over the cold steel tables of morgues, too many fathers gripping their sons by the collar in courtroom lobbies. She didn't just enforce laws, she fought for the dignity of the people those laws were supposed to protect. Yet Renee's story wasn't carved out of privilege. She had grown up in a two-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at a hospital cafeteria. Her earliest lessons weren't about statutes and codes, they were about resilience, about watching her mother's hands crack from washing dishes in scalding water, yet never once hearing her complain. About being told that if she wanted respect, she'd have to demand it in a world that would rarely give it freely. By the time Renee was 20, she was already climbing through the academy with a reputation for toughness and a sharp mind. Her peers learned quickly not to mistake her quiet for weakness. She graduated top of her class, walked into patrol with a target on her back, and slowly rose through ranks that weren't designed for someone like her. At 38, she made deputy chief. By 42, she wore the title of chief, the first black woman to ever hold the position in her city. The success brought money, speaking engagements, investments. She was comfortable now, even wealthy, but that comfort never erased the memory of what it took to get there. And it never shielded her from the reality that no amount of achievement could scrub her skin clean of the stereotypes others clung to. In boardrooms, executives sometimes spoke around her, assuming her presence was ceremonial. On the streets, strangers mistook her for staff rather than the person who signed off on the patrol budgets. Power, yes, but protection, never. That morning, as she stepped through the sliding glass doors of the airport, Renee carried more than a Louis Vuitton bag and a first-class boarding pass. She carried years of proving herself in rooms where her presence was questioned. She carried the invisible armor of knowing her worth in a world that still tried to diminish it. And she carried the weight of an agenda, because she wasn't just traveling for leisure. She was on her way to a national law enforcement summit where she would deliver the keynote address about systemic reform, racial bias, and accountability. Walking through security, she felt the eyes linger. A TSA agent double-checked her ID, glancing longer than usual before handing it back. A businessman in a pressed navy suit stood beside her at the scanner, shifting uncomfortably as though her proximity required justification. She had seen these looks 1,000 times. They didn't sting anymore, but they reminded her of the battlefield she walked through daily, one where assumptions were often sharper than bullets. Still, she kept her posture straight, her chin lifted. She passed through checkpoints, found her gate, and eventually boarded. She didn't expect celebration, didn't expect warmth, but she expected civility. She had earned at least that much. When Renee arrived at her seat in first class, the first flicker of hostility wasn't loud. It came as a raised eyebrow from a flight attendant, a tone too clipped to be neutral. "Are you sure this is your seat?" She slid the ticket across without a word, letting the attendant read for herself. The attendant nodded quickly, but the smirk remained, as if the error wasn't in doubt, but in Renee daring to correct it. Then came the couple across the aisle. The man leaned toward his wife, whispering just loud enough for Renee to catch fragments. Words like upgrade and mistake. She had heard them all before, and though her jaw tightened, she said nothing. She fastened her belt, placed her bag beneath the seat, and focused on steady breathing. But the atmosphere had already shifted. A space meant to symbolize privilege and comfort had turned into yet another test of endurance. She sat in the very seat her money and status afforded her, yet still bore the weight of scrutiny that seemed to follow wherever she went. And though she didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning. The glances would soon harden into confrontation. And confrontation into something no one on that flight would ever forget. The plane hadn't even left the gate before the unease in the cabin thickened. Renee adjusted her seatbelt, trying to settle into the leather that was supposed to signal comfort. Yet every glance around her seemed to remind her that she didn't belong, at least not in the eyes of those watching. The whispers hadn't stopped. The couple across the aisle spoke in muted tones, but the words carried. The man muttered something about standard slipping, while his wife's eyes flicked toward Renee's designer bag as though it couldn't possibly be hers. Renee kept her focus on the magazine in her lap, flipping through pages she didn't care to read. She'd done this before, mastered the art of stillness, of refusing to give strangers the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. But inside, the question nagged. Why was it so hard for some people to accept that a black woman could afford the very same luxuries they took for granted? The first attendant passed through the cabin offering drinks. She smiled warmly at the couple, then turned to Renee with a tone clipped enough to slice through steel. "Water?" she asked flatly, as though Renee's request for anything else would be out of line. When Renee answered politely, "I'll take a ginger ale, please," the attendant's eyebrow arched just slightly, and instead of acknowledgement, there was a pause, the kind designed to make someone feel as though they'd broken an unspoken rule. When the can landed on her tray, unopened, Renee thanked her anyway. Years in uniform had taught her that dignity wasn't in how others treated you, it was in how you chose to respond. A few rows back, a phone camera tilted up, its lens catching her in the frame. The young man holding it wasn't subtle, pretending to scroll but angling in her direction. She knew that game. People documented her not out of admiration, but as though she were an oddity worth capturing, evidence of someone who looked out of place. Renee leaned back, exhaling slowly, reminding herself that she wasn't here for them. She was here to deliver a keynote address that could ripple across the nation. She wasn't about to waste her energy on narrow stares and half-smiles that said more about them than about her. But still, the current of tension pulled tighter. The boarding door closed. The hum of the engines vibrated faintly beneath the cabin floor. An announcement crackled overhead, the captain assuring passengers of a smooth journey once clearance came through. Renee closed her eyes briefly, trying to center herself. Then, a voice, sharp, authoritative. Too close. "Ma'am, I need to see your boarding pass again." It wasn't the attendant this time. It was the pilot himself, standing tall at the front of first class, hat brim casting a shadow across narrowed eyes. His presence there was unusual. Pilots rarely entered the cabin except to greet passengers or address issues discreetly. But there he was, hand extended, waiting. Renee opened her eyes and met his stare. Calm, unblinking. She pulled the ticket from the sleeve in front of her and placed it in his palm. He glanced at it, barely more than a flick of his eyes, then returned it with a shrug that said nothing was wrong with the seat, only with the woman occupying it. "You'll need to follow the crew's instructions," he said, his tone clipped, formal, but dripping with something else. "We won't tolerate disruptions." Disruptions. The word hung heavy. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't moved out of turn. The only disruption was his decision to single her out. Renee's response was measured. "I am following instructions. I'm seated as assigned." The pilot's lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced around the cabin, almost as if gathering witnesses to his authority. A few passengers nodded faintly, complicit in silence. Others shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to involve themselves. It wasn't a confrontation yet, but it was close. The air carried the tension of a fuse burning short. The attendant reappeared at his side, whispering something in his ear. Renee couldn't hear the words, but she saw the nod. The pilot straightened his shoulders, his eyes returned to hers. And in that moment, she recognized what was happening. This wasn't about safety protocol. It wasn't about procedure. It was about control, his control, and the audacity of a black woman who dared to occupy a space some believed should never be hers. Renee's pulse stayed steady, but her mind sharpened. She had walked into countless rooms where men twice as Ace's age tried to intimidate her with the same look. She had disarmed gang leaders with less arrogance in their tone. She was not about to bow to the theater of his authority. She folded her ticket neatly, placed it back in the sleeve, and said nothing more. Silence, she knew, could carry more weight than any argument. But the pilot misread it. He took her stillness, not as discipline, but as defiance. And when arrogance meets ignorance, the line between authority and abuse grows dangerously thin. The fuse had burned short, and the spark was seconds away. The cabin had gone quiet after the pilot's warning, but it wasn't the comfortable quiet of anticipation before a flight. It was the kind of silence that comes when everyone senses something is wrong, but no one dares to speak it aloud. Renee sat still, hands folded over her lap, eyes forward. She was no stranger to challenges to her authority, but the setting made this different. This wasn't a precinct hallway or a courtroom lobby. This was a sealed cabin, and the person confronting her wasn't just a man with a uniform. He was the one who controlled whether the plane left the ground. The pilot didn't move on. He lingered in the aisle, glancing over her seat, then turning his voice up loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Passengers are expected to comply at all times. If you can't do that, we'll have a problem." Renee shifted her gaze toward him, calm but firm. "I am in compliance. I'm seated where I'm assigned. I haven't caused a disturbance." His eyes narrowed, and with them came that familiar expression she had seen too many times. Disbelief that a black woman could respond without lowering her head, without folding into apology. The couple across the aisle looked on with smug curiosity, as though waiting for a spectacle they'd been promised by years of entitlement. A man in the second row leaned toward his neighbor and muttered, "This is why flights get delayed." The words weren't subtle. They weren't meant to be. The pilot took a step closer, his shadow falling across her. He adjusted his cap, straightened his tie, and leaned down slightly. "Then let's make sure there are no more misunderstandings," he said. His voice had shifted from professional to personal, edged with irritation. Renee didn't flinch. "There won't be, unless you create one." It was a line drawn in the air, quiet, steady, undeniable. For some in that cabin, it was a sign of strength. For him, it was the one thing he couldn't tolerate. He snapped. In one sudden motion, his hand came down across her face. The crack cut through the cabin louder than the engines. Heads turned instantly. Eyes widened, jaws dropped. The woman in the window seat gasped so hard she nearly choked on her breath. Phones rose like reflexes, their red recording lights capturing the aftermath in high definition. Renee didn't lift a hand. She didn't shout. She didn't cry out in shock. She sat, the side of her face stinging, her eyes locked on his, as if daring him to realize what he had just done. The silence after the slap was heavier than the blow itself. No one reached for her. No one reached for him. Passengers froze, caught between disbelief and cowardice. Finally, a voice broke the standstill. A man further back called out, "You can't do that." Another joined, "She didn't do anything." But their outrage was weak, hesitant, the kind that fades when challenged. The pilot, red-faced now, barked back, "She refused to cooperate. I won't have disorder in my cabin." Disorder. That word again. For Renee, it was more than an excuse. It was the oldest script. Disorder meant defiance. Defiance meant punishment. And punishment was what he thought she deserved for daring to match his authority with her composure. Renee lifted her chin slowly, the mark of his hand still fresh across her cheek. When she spoke, her voice carried across the rows, low but steady. "I am Chief of Police Renee Carter, and you just assaulted me." The impact of her words rippled instantly. Passengers exchanged startled glances. Some pulled their phones closer, whispering, "Chief of Police? Did she say Chief of Police?" The confidence on the pilot's face faltered, but pride kept him upright. He scoffed, tried to wave it away with a sharp gesture. But the passengers weren't dismissing it. Their murmurs grew. Their lenses zoomed. The couple across the aisle shrank back, their smugness replaced with unease. The attendants, frozen a moment earlier, scrambled now, voices trembling as they tried to calm the cabin. "Everyone please remain seated," one said, her eyes darting between Renee and the man who had just crossed a line too far. But nothing would erase what they had all witnessed. The moment was sealed, captured, already racing across networks faster than the plane could ever hope to fly. Renee didn't shout, she didn't move from her seat, she only repeated, more firmly this time, "I am Chief of Police. You are under investigation the moment we land." Her tone wasn't theatrical. It was official, controlled, lethal in its certainty. And for the first time since he stepped into the aisle, the pilot hesitated. The entire cabin leaned into that pause, waiting to see what came next. The slap was over, but the fallout had just begun. The sound of the slap had barely faded before the cabin erupted. Gasps turned into shouts. Phones lifted higher, screens glowing as passengers scrambled to capture what they had just seen. Some voices trembled with outrage, others hissed with quiet disbelief. "Did he just hit her?" A woman in row 4 demanded. "He can't do that. She didn't do anything," another voice shouted. But just as quickly, there were murmurs of the opposite kind, muttered behind cupped hands and lowered tones. "She must have provoked him. You don't get slapped like that unless you ask for it." Words meant to excuse violence, whispered not out of certainty but out of loyalty to a system that had always protected people who looked like him. The attendants rushed forward, their panic barely contained. One of them tried to push Renee's tray upright, as though tidying the mess could erase what had happened. "Everyone remain calm, please," she repeated, her voice cracking. The cabin was anything but calm. The pilot, red-faced and rattled, barked orders at no one in particular. "Shut those phones off. This is a federal offense." His voice cracked louder than the engines, but not a single passenger lowered their camera. If anything, more hands rose into the air, determined to record. And then Renee spoke. She didn't raise her voice, but the weight in it, silenced, rose at a time. "You've just assaulted me in front of over 100 witnesses. You will not silence anyone in this cabin, not me and not them." Her words cut through the noise like steel. The passengers closest to her leaned in, stunned at her composure. They expected rage, maybe even retaliation. Instead, they found themselves staring at a woman who radiated control, the kind of control born not from submission, but from authority. The pilot's mouth opened, but nothing came out. His authority had cracked, and everyone watching knew it. Still, the current of racism ran strong through the silence that followed. A man in business class shouted from 2 rows back, "This is why flights get grounded. People who can't follow rules." His accusation wasn't directed at the pilot. It was pointed squarely at Renee, the woman who had done nothing but sit in her seat. Heads turned toward him. For a second, some passengers nodded reflexively, as if agreeing. Old prejudices lingered like reflexes. Easier to believe a black woman was the problem than to admit a pilot had lost control. But the videos kept rolling, and the evidence was undeniable. The flight attendants exchanged frantic looks. One whispered to another, "We need security at the gate." The words weren't meant for Renee, but she heard them. And in that moment, she saw the pattern forming. The same pattern that had played out across years of policing. The victim recast as the aggressor, the authority figure protected at all costs, the truth buried beneath procedure. Renee straightened in her seat. Her voice carried again. Call security. Do it. Because when they step through that door, they won't be here for me. The rows behind her buzzed again, this time with agreement. A woman near the back clapped once, sharply, and said, "She's right. He hit her. We all saw it." Another passenger chimed in, "I've got the whole thing on video." The tide was shifting, slowly but visibly. The pilot's jaw worked as though he might argue, but even he knew the balance of power had slipped. He muttered to the attendants and retreated up the aisle, disappearing into the cockpit. His exit left a vacuum in the cabin, a mix of unease and a strange new respect for the woman he had tried to humiliate. Renee didn't relax. She knew how quickly situations like this could turn. She had been on both sides of that line, as a young officer called to de-escalate, and now as the one subjected to escalation. Her badge didn't shield her here. Her title didn't soften the bias that had boiled over. But she also knew something else. Silence was a weapon. And tonight, it wasn't hers to bear. It belonged to the people filming, the witnesses who would decide whether this moment lived and died in the cabin, or whether it became a story the world would have to face. A soft chime sounded. The cabin door hissed open again. Security uniforms appeared at the entrance, stepping inside with practiced calm. The passengers erupted again, voices rising, fingers pointing toward the cockpit. "There, the pilot! He hit her! Check the videos!" The officers froze, taken aback by the direction of the outrage. They had expected to walk in and see a disruptive passenger. Instead, they walked in on an entire cabin demanding justice against their own captain. Renee turned her head slowly toward them, her expression still controlled. "You're looking for me, aren't you?" she said, voice calm but edged. Then she lifted her chin. "Look closer. You'll see who the real problem is." The tension hadn't broken. It had only shifted. And now, every passenger knew they weren't just watching a flight delay. They were standing inside the beginning of something far larger. Something that would follow them beyond this cabin, beyond this airport, and into the headlines by nightfall. The officers who entered the cabin hesitated in the aisle, eyes darting from passenger to passenger as the noise swelled. They expected disorder from a traveler, but instead they were confronted with a chorus of witnesses demanding accountability for a uniformed man who had walked back into the cockpit as though nothing had happened. "He slapped her," someone shouted. "We have it on video," another voice echoed. Phones waved like banners of proof. Security couldn't ignore the glow of screens replaying the scene in shaky hands, the sharp sound of the pilot's hand connecting with Renee's face now immortalized in pixels. Renee didn't rise from her seat. She didn't need to. Her voice carried across the rows with a calmness that silenced even the loudest voices for a moment. "You've seen the videos. You've heard these passengers. I am Chief of Police Renee Carter. And I am pressing charges." The weight of her words landed heavy. Some passengers gasped, realizing the magnitude of what had just unfolded. Others leaned in, whispering to their neighbors, "She's the chief of police." The officers shifted uneasily. Authority recognized authority, and suddenly their orders weren't as simple as removing a passenger. The chain of power had tilted. But the airline tried to seize it back. The lead attendant's voice rose over the din. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. The captain acted to ensure safety on board. We'll resolve this once we're back at the gate." Safety. The word stung like salt in an open wound. Passengers scoffed, muttered, some shouted back. Safety? He hit her. The contradiction was too blatant to ignore. By the time the plane returned to the gate, the incident had already escaped the confines of the cabin. Videos were live, uploaded in real time. Twitter feeds lit up. Pilot assaults black woman in first class. Hashtags formed within minutes. On TikTok, clips circulated faster than boarding announcements could keep up. One video showed the slap in slow motion, the caption screaming, "This is America." Another showed Renee's calm declaration of her title, garnering comments like, "She handled that better than anyone I know." And imagine slapping the chief of police. That man's career is over. Renee walked off the plane flanked by passengers who insisted on following her, recording as they went. Their voices rose in the terminal. "She's the victim. Don't let them twist it." Strangers in the boarding area paused, phones lifted, catching the scene unfolding live. The airline issued a statement within the hour. Sterile. Detached. An incident occurred on board Flight 278 involving a passenger and the flight crew. We are conducting an internal review. No mention of an assault, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The words read like a script designed to protect the uniform, not the truth. But the truth was already out. The videos told a story no statement could hide, and the public was choosing sides fast. News outlets picked it up by evening. Anchors' voices carried across living rooms. A viral video appears to show a pilot striking a black female passenger seated in first class. That passenger has now been identified as Chief of Police Renee Carter. Clips replayed endlessly, the slap, the stunned silence, Renee's voice declaring her identity. Analysts shook their heads in disbelief. This isn't just about one incident, one commentator said. This exposes a deeper issue. How black professionals, even at the highest levels, face humiliation in spaces where others move freely. Meanwhile, the airline's boardroom buzzed with panic. Executives debated damage control. Should they suspend the pilot, apologize, deny? Every option seemed to worsen their position. Investors called in, jittery about contracts that hung on the company's reputation. And Renee? She didn't retreat. She walked straight into the terminal press gaggle. Cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Her words were brief but searing. I was assaulted for daring to sit in the seat I paid for. This wasn't about procedure. This was about perception. My skin made me guilty before I spoke a word. Her statement traveled faster than the airline's carefully worded release. It wasn't just a soundbite. It was a verdict delivered to millions watching from their phones, laptops, and living rooms. And the ripple widened. Civil rights leaders called for investigations. Legal analysts dissected the pilot's actions frame by frame. Comment sections filled with both solidarity and denial. Proof that racism was still a battlefield fought in real time under the glare of viral attention. Inside her hotel room that night, Renee sat alone, her cheeks still faintly marked. She had seen violence before, but this time it wasn't the sting of the hand that lingered. It was the knowledge that her title, her wealth, her accomplishments had not shielded her. Not on that plane, not in that cabin. And yet, she knew something else too. The story had slipped out of the airline's control. What they meant to bury had already taken root. By morning, it wouldn't just be a headline, it would be a reckoning. By morning, the airline's name was everywhere. Screens in cafes, office lobbies, and even gym treadmills replayed the same clip. A pilot's hand striking the face of a black woman seated calmly in first class. Commentators debated tone and intent, but the image was undeniable. A uniformed captain had crossed a line no press release could erase. Inside the airline's headquarters, executives huddled in crisis meetings. They spoke in terms of liability, contracts, and reputational damage. What none of them seemed willing to admit was that their worst nightmare wasn't the video itself, it was who they had struck. Renee Carter wasn't just any passenger. She was the chief of police for a major city, with a resume respected at the federal level and connections stretching into Washington. She wasn't someone they could silence with a voucher or an apology drafted by public relations. She held the power of both public opinion and institutional authority. And she knew it. While the airline scrambled, Renee was already on the phone with city officials, federal transportation contacts, and civil rights attorneys she trusted. Her voice was calm, measured, but her words carried weight. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was racism, plain and simple, and the world saw it. Her first call was to the federal agency that oversaw law enforcement contracts with commercial carriers. For years, her department had relied on flights for prisoner transfers and officer travel. Those contracts were worth millions. Now she was urging the agency to reconsider. How can we trust them with our officers, she asked, when they assault their own paying passengers? The second call was to a friend on Capitol Hill, a congresswoman who had fought alongside her for criminal justice reform. By noon, that congresswoman's Twitter account lit up with a fiery post. If airlines can't guarantee dignity and safety to black women in first class, how can they guarantee it to anyone? Accountability must come now. The message spread quickly. Within hours, reporters were camped outside the airline's offices, demanding answers. Stock tickers ran red as shares dipped in response to investor panic. The slap had become more than a scandal. It was a financial threat. But Renee wasn't finished. She held a press conference that afternoon, not in uniform, but in a tailored Navy suit that underscored her authority. Cameras flashed as she stepped up to the podium. Her voice was steady, her expression resolute. I was struck not because I broke a rule, but because I broke an assumption, she said. The assumption that a black woman in first class must be out of place. That dignity, no matter how hard-earned, is still conditional. I will not accept that, and neither should this country. The crowd erupted with questions, but she kept her statement brief. The soundbite was enough. News outlets ran it on a loop, each repetition tightening the noose around the airline's reputation. Inside boardrooms, analysts scrambled to measure the fallout. One anchor on a financial network shook his head in disbelief. This was supposed to be a routine week for the airline, with talks of an international expansion deal. Now those negotiations are frozen. Investors are asking how management let a $200 million partnership collapse over one captain's arrogance. Passengers, meanwhile, voiced their own stories. Comment sections filled with testimonies. I was followed to the bathroom because I looked suspicious. They made me prove my seat 3 times. This is nothing new. Renee's case had given them permission to speak, and their voices amplified the realities she had been saying for years. Racism wasn't a series of isolated incidents. It was a system that lived in the fabric of everyday travel. And for once, that system was on the defensive. The airline tried to fight back with another statement, this time naming the pilot, claiming he had been placed on leave, pending review. But the language was still cold, legalistic, as if they were protecting themselves more than the passengers they served. Renee responded the way she always did, directly. Leave pending review is not accountability, she told reporters. It's a pause button, and we are past the point of pausing. Her words weren't just about her. They were about every person who had sat in a seat they'd paid for and been told they didn't belong. Every traveler forced to show ID twice when others were waved through. Every quiet humiliation brushed off as a misunderstanding. By evening, legal filings were drafted. Civil rights attorneys prepared lawsuits not only against the pilot, but also against the airline itself. Federal officials announced preliminary investigations. Advocacy groups rallied in airports across the country, holding signs that read, "Her seat, her right." The pilot who had raised his hand never expected his career to implode in less than 24 hours. But Renee knew better. She had seen this pattern before, a man secure in privilege, assuming his authority was untouchable. What he hadn't counted on was striking someone whose silence wasn't for sale. For Renee, this wasn't revenge, it was responsibility. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who might never have the title of chief or the resources to be heard. And as the airline's shares sank deeper and politicians demanded answers, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't going away quietly. The pilot had struck her to shut her down. Instead, he had ignited a movement she was now determined to lead. The headlines kept rolling, but beneath the noise of breaking news lay a quieter, heavier truth. What happened to Renee Carter wasn't new. It wasn't unique. It was part of a long line of indignities that passengers of color had endured in silence, dismissed as misunderstandings, buried under corporate apologies that never named the real issue. Social media brought it into focus. Hashtags trended not just because of the slap, but because thousands of people poured their own experiences into the digital space. A black doctor posted, "I was asked to leave first class because they didn't believe my boarding pass was real." A lawyer wrote, "I had to show ID 3 times before they let me sit in the seat I paid for." A college student shared, "They made me prove my carry-on wasn't stolen." Each story mirrored Renee's, echoing the same question. How many times must worth be proven before it's accepted? The conversation spread beyond travel. It became a mirror for boardrooms, classrooms, and even neighborhood sidewalks. If a chief of police, a woman with power and wealth, could be humiliated in front of a plane full of witnesses, what chance did a teenager have? What chance did the single mother, the janitor, the cashier, the everyday worker have? Commentators on morning news shows put it plainly. One analyst said, "This isn't about one man's bad decision. It's about the assumption of guilt placed on black bodies in spaces considered exclusive. That's what first class represents. Not just comfort, but exclusion." And when she refused to shrink, the system reacted the only way it knew how, through force. Renee watched those broadcasts with a mix of anger and recognition. She had lived those truths long before cameras caught her story. She remembered being a young officer, stopped in plain clothes on her way home, forced to show her badge 3 times before another officer believed her. She remembered the sting of being ignored in meetings, only for her male counterparts to repeat her words and be applauded. What happened on that plane was simply the most visible version of what she and countless others carried every day. The bigger picture wasn't just about personal bias, it was institutional. Reports surfaced citing studies on air travel. Black passengers were more likely to be flagged for random checks, more likely to be asked to prove their seat, more likely to be accused of non-compliance. Each statistic wasn't just a number, it was someone's dignity stripped in public. Airlines often hid behind phrases like safety protocols and crew discretion. But those words became shields, protecting prejudice under the guise of procedure. Renee had spent her career dismantling those shields in policing, and now she was watching the same battle unfold 30,000 feet in the air. Community leaders seized the moment. Civil rights activists stood in front of terminals with megaphones, declaring, "This is bigger than one slap. This is about centuries of being told we don't belong." Signs carried through airports read, "Her seat, her right." Passengers of every background joined in, some holding up their own tickets as symbols, others simply standing in solidarity. And yet, even as the outrage grew, so did the resistance. Comment threads filled with defenders of the pilot, calling him a hero for enforcing order, suggesting Renee exaggerated, or that passengers couldn't know what really happened. The denial wasn't surprising to her. It was the same denial that had met every public case of racial injustice. For every voice demanding accountability, there was another insisting racism wasn't the issue at all. But this time, denial couldn't bury the evidence. The video existed. The sound of that slap existed. And the calm, steady voice of a black woman declaring her title, "I am Chief of Police," existed. Those three elements together stripped away the excuses. For Renee, the bigger picture wasn't just about proving her own dignity. It was about forcing the country to confront an uncomfortable truth. No matter how high you climbed, how much you achieved, how much you earned, racism could still pull you back into the cage of assumption. And if it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. That night, as she prepared for yet another interview, she wrote a single line on her notepad. Not for the cameras, not for the press, just for herself. Power without justice is fragile. Justice without power is ignored. The slap had become a symbol, but the fight ahead was larger than her bruised cheek. It was about breaking the cycle of silence that let incidents like this pass without consequence. And now, with the world watching, she wasn't going to let silence win. Renee could have retreated. Many told her to. Colleagues urged caution. Advisors suggested letting the legal system work quietly, and even friends worried for her safety. But silence had never been her language, and she wasn't about to let a slap in first class fade into a press release buried on page 10. She took the stage days later at the National Law Enforcement Summit she had originally been traveling to attend. The keynote she was scheduled to deliver about reform shifted overnight. Now, every eye in the packed auditorium, every camera broadcasting live, waited to hear her speak not only as a police chief, but as a woman who had just endured a very public humiliation. Her opening words weren't polished for comfort. They were carved from the rawness of experience. "I was assaulted because someone looked at me and saw a problem where there was none. I was assaulted because my presence in first class challenged a lie many people still believe, that worth is measured by skin, not by character." The room fell silent. Not the silence of politeness, but the silence of recognition. She went on, her voice steady. "This isn't just my story. It belongs to every passenger asked to prove their right to sit in a seat they paid for. Every traveler forced to show ID twice when others were waved through. Every professional mistaken for staff while standing in a room they earned their place in. Dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right, and until we treat it that way, we are failing as a nation." Her words spread quickly, lifted into headlines, quoted across social media. Dignity isn't a privilege, it's a right. The phrase became a rallying cry. Protesters painted it on banners in airports. Activists used it as hashtags. Even celebrities reposted her clip, declaring solidarity. But Renee didn't stop at speeches. She launched a task force dedicated to passenger rights, working with lawmakers to push for stronger protections against discrimination in air travel. She called for mandatory training that went beyond empty diversity seminars, training tied to accountability where crew members could be removed if they weaponized their authority against passengers of color. Civil rights groups rallied around her, amplifying her message. Donations poured in to fund legal battles for travelers who had been mistreated. Ordinary people, teachers, nurses, students, sent her letters describing their own experiences. One note read, "When I saw you hold your ground, I finally believed I could tell my story too." Another said, "You didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for me and my daughter, and every time we've been told we don't belong." And still, the pushback came. Critics on talk shows accused her of politicizing the incident. Some questioned whether she had provoked the confrontation. Renee answered them the same way she had answered the pilot, with steady defiance. "The only thing I provoked was fear in a man who couldn't accept that a black woman belonged where he thought she didn't. That's not provocation, that's truth." Her composure made her harder to dismiss. She didn't scream into microphones, didn't crumble under the weight of scrutiny. She spoke plainly, firmly, in a voice that carried the authority of both her badge and her lived reality. Weeks passed, but the momentum didn't fade. Legislators introduced bills named in her honor, aimed at expanding protections for airline passengers against discriminatory practices. Universities invited her to speak. Community groups began hosting Know Your Rights workshops at airports. For Renee, the transformation was bittersweet. She hadn't asked to become a symbol. She hadn't planned for her face to appear on posters or her words to spark chants in crowded terminals. But she understood the responsibility. The slap that was meant to reduce her had instead expanded her reach. She carried that responsibility carefully, reminding herself in quiet moments that movements weren't built on single names, but on collective courage. She wasn't the only one who had lived this. She just happened to be the one who could no longer be ignored. At a rally months later, standing before a crowd holding signs of solidarity, she ended her speech with a line that would stay with them long after the microphones shut off. "They thought they were striking me down, but what they struck was a spark. And together, we are the fire." The applause rolled like thunder. Not the applause of admiration alone, but of shared pain and shared resolve. The echoes of that moment stretched far beyond the rally. They traveled through the stories of everyday people who felt seen for the first time. They traveled through the corridors of power, forcing conversations that had long been avoided. And most of all, they traveled through Renee herself, reminding her that dignity reclaimed can inspire dignity demanded. The story of a single slap had traveled farther than any plane ever could. It wasn't just a headline now. It was a mirror that showed how quickly dignity could be stripped from someone whose very life had been built on defending others. For weeks, the video played again and again, in living rooms, classrooms, newsrooms. Each replay sparked the same sharp intake of breath, the same disbelief. And yet, for Black travelers across the country, it wasn't disbelief at all. It was recognition. Letters and messages poured in, some handwritten on paper smudged with tears, others typed out in quick bursts between shifts. A grandmother wrote, "I was told to move from my seat because they said I didn't belong in business class. I never spoke about it until now. Thank you for giving me my voice back." A young college student said, "I saw myself in you. Calm, silent, but inside breaking. Your strength reminded me I deserve better." Every message carried the same theme. This wasn't just Renee's story, it was theirs, and that's why it mattered, because for every camera that caught the slap, there were 1,000 indignities that never made it to video. Every time someone clutched their bag tighter in an elevator, every time a raised eyebrow questioned whether a Black woman belonged in the boardroom, every time silence screamed louder than words. Renee's fight wasn't just about a pilot's arrogance. It was about the systems that allowed him to believe he could raise his hand and be protected by the title stitched to his uniform. It was about an airline that spoke of safety while ignoring the violence committed in its own cabin. It was about a culture that still hesitates to believe Black dignity is equal dignity. And yet, through the pain, something stronger had emerged. Hope. Hope carried in the passengers who spoke up when they realized silence would make them accomplices. Hope carried in the millions who shared the video, not to sensationalize, but to demand accountability. Hope carried in every child who saw Renee stand tall and thought, if she can, so can I. She had turned humiliation into power. She had turned silence into speech. She had turned a moment meant to diminish her into a movement that demanded better for everyone. And so, the final truth was clear. The pilot thought he struck down a single woman. What he struck was a wall of history, resistance, and resilience. What he struck was a movement. If you've watched this far, you know stories like this aren't just stories. They are reminders. Reminders that silence can no longer be an option. Reminders that dignity isn't granted, it must be defended. And reminders that racism, whether whispered in a glance or shouted through violence, must always be called out. So let me ask you, where are you watching from? What country? What city? Because these stories aren't bound by borders. They live everywhere. And when you share your voice, when you tell your truth, you help turn echoes into change. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the strength it takes to stand tall when the world tries to cut you down, then subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. Not just for more stories, but to be part of a community that refuses to stay silent. Because Renee Carter didn't just endure a slap, she exposed a system. And in doing so, she reminded all of us of a simple, unshakable truth. Dignity is not negotiable.